There's no question that our best, strongest pain medicines are the opioids. The rate of addiction amongst pain patients who are treated by doctors is much less than 1%.
Hey! 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 Hey!
Need to get that stomach.
She needs Narcan.
Oh my God.
Prescription opioid drugs wrapped their tentacles around my daughter and squeezed the life out of her.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Perry Peltz, and I know those images that you just saw, they are really, really hard to look at because that's what it looks like to overdose. And by the end of the day today, more than 150 people in this country will have died from an opioid overdose. The opioid epidemic is the worst epidemic, the worst drug epidemic that we've ever experienced in this country. And a lot of it gets right back to drugs that many of us here in this audience have in their own medicine chest. We're talking about Percocet, Vicodin, OxyContin, Dilaudid, and that's just to name a few. And make no mistake about it, those drugs are also opioids, just like heroin, which is an illegal opioid. There's an important part of this story that you may not have heard. What the drug industry, the pharmaceutical industry, would like you to believe is that people who are overdosing, like those images that you saw, that those are just bad kids abusing good drugs, and that they're really getting in the way of our ability to take good medicine. That narrative is something that we have to fight against because it's just plain wrong. People who are overdosing, people who are dying, people who are addicted have a brain disease, and it's called addiction. And it is not a moral failing. And the woman sitting right next to me here, Janis McGrory, knows that story all too well. And Janis, I have to say, because it has to be said, that sharing your story, no matter how often you do it, is painful and difficult. And we so appreciate the bravery that you show every time that you share it. So thank you. First of all, Janis, I want you to tell everybody, I think we saw a couple of the images of your daughter, Liz, in that video. Liz was 23 when she overdosed and died?
She was 23.
Tell us about her.
Well, my daughter Liz, and this is Liz's story. This is really, it's a tough story. Those images that you just saw they're tough, but they really were my Liz. And Liz started experimenting with drugs. She did not have a sports injury. She began, going to some parties in high school, and she took OxyContin, and she liked it. It made her feel good and powerful, and she started taking more and more. And it's very, you don't notice it. I never noticed right away that her behavior was kind of off, but there were some signs. And she started changing. Her behavior started changing a little bit more and more until her senior year. One of her friends called and said, "I'm really concerned about Liz. I think she's shooting heroin." And I thought, oh my goodness, that can't be. I mean, my daughter was an A student. She was in the National Honor Society. She graduated 10th in our class. She had a great group of friends. She was a cheerleader. She was a soccer player. She was your all-American kid. And I had the drug talk with her. We had those programs in our school. Liz said, "Oh, Mom, what do you mean? I would never do that. I would never take those drugs. I understand that." Yet she took that first drug and she liked it. It made her feel good. And her senior year, graduated, had a wonderful scholarship to Johnson & Wales in Rhode Island, presidential award, and she was shooting heroin. So she went from taking these pills to shooting a needle, putting a needle in her arm. And that started the whole cycle.
You know, what I want to jump in, Janis, and say, and it's really important and worth mentioning, that when we hear about people, whether they're young or they're not young, experimenting with drugs and taking a Percocet or taking an Oxycontin, that happens because so many of us keep those prescriptions in our medicine chest, and we've got to get rid of them. So if there's one thing that everybody does today, get rid of those drugs. Those drugs have a way of finding their way into the wrong place. And you know, young people who are experimenting and take the pill, and addiction and dependence can happen really quickly. Janis, but when you talk about that switch over to heroin, I think it's really important because a lot of people say, well, how do you go from A to B? How do you start taking a pill and then wind up shooting heroin? And unfortunately, the answer is pretty obvious because they are both opioids. But explain, you know, as we talked about before, no one wakes up one day and says, you know, this morning what I'm going to do, I'm going to shoot heroin because that seems like that's going to be a fun thing to do. It's not how it happens.
It's not how it happens. An addiction is it takes over, a young brain, it takes over your brain. It rewires brains, those young, wonderful things in our head that are, they're growing and they're new and they're absorbing different patterns and different behaviors. And once you take that drug, your brain is rewired to continue that habit. So Oxycontin, she was taking these pills, she wiped out her entire bank account paying for these pills that are $40, $80 a pop. Pretty soon, she doesn't have any money, but she's addicted to this drug. She needs to have it. She needs to have it to survive, because if she doesn't have it, so now it's not a pleasure thing. She's dope sick, and she has to keep on refueling herself with this drug, and which then turned into heroin because it was cheaper. She had to turn to heroin.
How did you learn about Liz's overdose?
Well, Liz overdosed many times. She was brought back many times by Narcan, which is a reversal drug. I had a phone call from the police department a week after Christmas. It was January 6th, 2011. And now, having lived with substance abuse disorder and this addiction in my family, I was always kind of waiting for that call. I hate to say it, but my Liz was, she wasn't home too much anymore because she was out doing drugs. And I got a call from the police department saying that they had found Liz in an apartment with a needle stuck in her neck. And I had just talked to her a week earlier. She was coming out of a rehab center, and she was going to go into a sober house, which aren't the best places to go because there's drugs there. And she was released from this medical facility in the care of a doctor with 5 full prescriptions, 5 of them. 3 of them were antidepressants and for pain. 1 was a muscle relaxant, and the other was sleeping pills. all from the same doctor. This girl who is suffering from addiction, only for doctors to prescribe these drugs to her. There was nobody really taking care of her. It's an awful situation.
It is an awful situation, and all too often when you send a loved one to rehab, they don't believe often in giving them the opioid blockers that actually can make a difference. So always worth asking a rehab if they offer medication-assisted treatment. Janis, you obviously did everything as parents that you could possibly do. Describe for everyone here what it is like to be trying to help your child, and yet their brain, as you say, has been hijacked, literally and physically hijacked.
Well, as a mother, my priority is keeping my child safe, whether they're 2 or 15 or 21 or 30. That's what we do. We keep our children safe. And I felt helpless against this drug. Helpless. Liz came to me once and she said, "Mom, I need help. I need to go into detox." I said, now at this time, I had no idea what opioids were, what addiction was. I said, "Oh, okay." So, she went to detox. I thought she'd come out of detox and life would carry on. She could go to school. Because this girl, she was a smart girl, and she had so many dreams and aspirations. But it wasn't like that. She came out of detox, and then she wasn't put into a program. She relapsed, and that happened again and again and again. So I said, "Well, Liz, you're not going to college unless you get clean." And after seeing the program yesterday on the women in prison, I went to the courts because Liz would not go into a program voluntarily. I went to the courts twice, and I begged the judge to put her in jail. In the morning, I had the police knock on my door. They shackled her, put her in the cruiser, brought her down to the courthouse. And I had to go and say, "My daughter is endangering herself, and she's endangering others because she's driving a car." So that was my only option. To save my child was to throw her in jail. I did that twice. I've written letters to judges to say, "Please stipulate that this girl goes into a program for a month." She would come out a month, relapse, go back into that same behavior, because that drug owned my daughter. That drug owned my daughter. And I say, it wrapped its tentacles right around her body and just squeezed the life out of her. Literally squeezed the life out of her. She became a different person. If anybody's seen The Exorcist, and Linda Blair, well, my daughter went from this sweet, loving girl to this person I didn't know.
I know it's hard to square up the images that we see up there with the description about your experience when she was addicted to drugs. Janis, I want to have an opportunity for you to talk a little bit about your feelings and the work that you're doing to stop overprescribing and what you think the role of the pharmaceutical industry plays in all of this.
In my opinion, the pharmaceuticals knowingly, deliberately mass-marketed these pills, knowing that they were addictive. But they didn't tell the doctors. They didn't tell anybody how addictive they were, even though the studies were there, that 30 days later, if you took the prescription of 30 days Percocets and took however many there are a day, you'd be an addict at the end of those 30 days. So they flooded the market and misinformed people on this new wonder drug, this new pain med. They need to right this wrong. They need to right this wrong. And I'm pissed. I am pissed that they're getting away with it because nothing is being done to stop them. They continue, and they're making a ton of money. They're making a ton of money. This needs to stop.
And it's worth noting that Purdue Pharma, the company that makes OxyContin, sales are down in this country, which is good news. They were found guilty in 2006 of misleading the public in a criminal case, and yet, before you applaud, because it doesn't have a happy ending, in Europe, South America, Asia, the Philippines, they are using the exact same marketing techniques that they used here in this country 20 years ago. So the market is drying up here a bit, and they're turning their attention there. So your point, Janis, is very well taken.
And when I first started learning about this, I thought Purdue had to do with chickens. It's not chickens.
Unfortunately not. I want to end our session together, Janis, by giving you an opportunity to talk about what it is that all of us can do. And it goes back to something that we talked about in the beginning, which is a change in the narrative. And that has to do with stigma. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Right. We need to destigmatize what you think of as an addict, because we don't say addict anymore. We call it substance use disorder, or it's a disease. It's a disease like cancer. If you go into the hospital and you're diagnosed with cancer, you go into a hospital and you're surrounded by the best medical expertise, and you are treated properly. You're treated with respect and dignity. If you have substance abuse disorder, you're almost like cast aside. You're not welcomed into a hospital and said, oh, we'll take care of you, we'll make you feel better, we can do this for you. It's not like that. This is the face of an addict. And I speak for those 500,000 kids who have died over the last 10 years. Those 500,000 mothers who are trying to save their children from this disease. The stigma has to go away. This is a disease like any other. It should be treated like a disease with the respect and the dignity that they deserve. And I speak for all the mothers who have lost their children. I speak for all those people who are in recovery now, who are struggling. It's tough. It's really tough, but they deserve it. And they're struggling, and there's no support mechanisms around to help them, or there's not enough, let's put it that way. And I would like to say that our president, a few months ago, announced the opioid crisis as a national crisis. He spoke for half an hour on TV. I finally said, yes, somebody is finally listening and doing something about it. What happened? Nothing. No money, nothing. I have not seen. Yes, it is a national crisis. It's the biggest one we've ever had here in the United States. And yet I am outraged to think that our government is not doing something more about this.
Right. We have to do more, and we have to make sure that everyone in this country who has an addiction problem can get access to good and effective treatment. That is an absolute requirement. And it just bears mentioning and repeating the fact that this is an addiction epidemic. This is not an epidemic of abuse. So when you hear people use the word abuse, come back at them and say, no, this is addiction, because that is what the pharmaceutical industry wants you to believe. Janis McGrory, thank you. We are so unbelievably sorry. sorry for your profound loss, and we appreciate that you're taking out into the country and speaking out. We so appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.